The world is evolving at a faster pace than ever before, and as we begin the path to recovery after worldwide disruption, this podcast explores how the design industries can adapt to changing expectations and create a better future for both your businesses and your consumers. I'm Bethan Ryder, Executive Editorial Director here at WGSN. You're listening to Create Tomorrow, the WGSN podcast. The wider concept of gender identity has altered in the public consciousness over the past decade, with a more positive understanding emerging that gender is fluid and not a binary thing. This has been powered by the internet and social media, which has given voice to LGBTQ+ communities and activists. Education is more accessible, and as a consequence, notions of masculinity are also being viewed as a spectrum rather than a hackneyed set of strongman stereotypes. More recently, the COVID crisis has compounded changes right across society, and that includes men and masculinity. Combined with 2020's turbulent politics and apocalyptic undertones, masculinity is being reshaped and refracted in several contrasting directions at once, undergoing something of a return to discrete subcultures that would once have been shaped by music, sport or fashion, but today is being shaped by politics and economics. We're not here today to discuss gender identity politics, but rather more the concept of masculinity within the consumer landscape and how representation is changing and what this means for brands and the trends of tomorrow. Joining me to discuss this fascinating topic is Joe McDonnell, our Head of Insight. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Bethan. Good to be here.
And we also have Nick Paget, our Senior Strategist for Menswear. Hi, Nick.
Hi, Bethan. How are you?
I'm good. And where are you today?
I'm in Brighton, also kind of sunny at the moment.
Oh, lucky you. And we also have Annie Johnston, who's no stranger to the podcast, an analyst on our beauty platform. Hi, Annie.
Hi, Bethan.
Right, let's kick off. I think we'll go to you, Joe, first, because I think it's really important to get a kind of idea of the consumer insight side of things. And I'd love to hear really from you how you feel masculinity and notions of masculinity have been affected by the pandemic and some of those shifts we're seeing, particularly in the Gen Z and millennial space.
Yeah, it's a good question. So one of the things that we kind of say at WGSN is the extent to which the pandemic has accelerated trends that we're already seeing in the market. And it's also actually exposed a huge variety of things that were bubbling under the surface in society. I think probably one of the most stark impacts pan-industry has been this digitization. So a focus on, from a retail perspective, converting towards e-commerce. But the other thing to bear in mind is that consumers have been really bored for the last 2 years. And there's this thing that we've been tracking called this TikTokitization, which is a bit of a mouthful. But in an effort to cure your boredom, people have been turning to TikTok in massive droves. And actually, about 55 million people use TikTok every week in the US. It's the most downloaded app globally. But the thing that's probably most interesting about this is the algorithm. And, you know, if you use the app, I'm sure you're very familiar with the algorithm. It's absolutely incredible. And the Wall Street Journal have done something recently where they explore the algorithm and how quickly it gives you the content that you want using bots. And it's incredibly advanced. But actually what it's doing is changing the notions of masculinity, particularly for Gen Z, because no matter where you are geographically, you're being exposed to this, to these different forms of masculinity, these kind of different videos. And one of the things that's emerged and is kind of playing a role in changing masculinity is straight talk videos. So kind of turning masculinity on its head, showing different relationships between men, kind of playing on that thirst trap idea. And there's lots of debate online about whether these videos are kind of authentic or whether people are just doing it for the views and for the likes. But it's definitely a step away from this kind of tough guy online persona. And it's very much expanding the way in which men think about themselves and the way that men act on social media. I think the other thing that's important to mention about the algorithm, and again, it's come under some criticism, and there's lots of stuff online about this, is that because it reinforces what people interact with, and it very quickly makes up a whole load of assumptions about you. It can do things like prioritize attractiveness, prioritize whiteness, prioritize a specific demographic, and use that as something that it showcases to different users as well.
I think what's interesting about TikTok too, I think traditionally there has been a tendency for, I mean, John Berger wrote about it, right? Men act and women appear, and men are active and women are passive in the way they appear. I think what's interesting about TikTok is it's got this real peacock element to it, right? Which in itself is kind of broadening a notion of masculinity, that men are happy to preen. And I mean, would you say, Nick, are you seeing that in kind of like the fashion space? It's almost like men have room to play and room to perform.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's been a phenomenon for quite a long time, sort of within a much smaller fashion bubble. So men attending trade shows like Pitti Uomo. I mean, that's very well documented on the website and informs a lot of our content, obviously. But I think that's become, thanks to social media, a much more acceptable thing. You know, men even just showing grids of their outfits and things like that. You know, even acknowledging that they put some thought into an outfit that they wear before they even take a picture of themselves wearing it is a huge deal. So yeah, peacocking on a massive scale is there, and I think someone actually said, I was talking to somebody the other day and they mentioned the term metrosexual, which is not something I've heard for a very long time, but has become so ingrained as an attitude now that I think is just part of the modern male psyche. I mean, you know, a step on from the TikToking thing is OnlyFans culture, and there are definitely a lot of straight men playing with sexual identities in a very kind of semi-provocative way. And embracing an identity that they would never have dreamt of and wouldn't have been allowed to dream of until very, very recently. So yeah, I think there's a literal interpretation of that in terms of the way people dress, and there's more of a mindset thing about very quickly changing identities and what's acceptable and what's not, for sure.
Just to note on that concept of performance, I guess gender is essentially a performance. It's a social construct, as argued in a lot of literature and by a lot of gender specialists. I guess you can say that fashion and beauty are almost props to that performance. And although most typical beauty products are now associated with femininity, there was very much a time when it was an expression of your masculinity. Up until the 18th century, really, fashion and beauty-wise, there wasn't really a big difference between men and women. In fact, if anything, aristocratic men were the ones that adorned themselves more so with blusher and wigs, among other things. You know, they were a symbol of power and wealth, etc. It was with a phenomenon called the Great Male Renunciation was when the divide really began. Men stripped back to bare faces, these rigid monochrome suits to show they were much more rational than women, should be taken more seriously, which of course we know now sounds ridiculous, but you can still see the effects of it with, female power dressing, which tends to be suits, pulled back, slicked hair.
Am I right in understanding that the move on from metrosexual, which, Nick, is something from our past, I guess, the 90s, but is soft boy? That's something that I think we've covered a little bit, haven't we, on Insight, Joe? The kind of soft boy movement. Yeah,
there's an element of that. It's quite complex, isn't it? Because it weaves in of this vulnerability that I think it's much more right for men to show now, and seems to be centered to that conversation about, how it's all right for men to express their feelings. It's okay for everyone to express that they may have mental health issues, that kind of thing, and expressing things which, until they were unraveled, men holding all this stuff in would have constituted the sort of toxic masculinity that has been very much on display.
And I suppose role models are always like a huge factor in this. And I wondered, you've already talked a little bit about TikTok, Joe, but what's happening? Kind of, people like to follow the celebrities and that kind of side of things. What are we seeing there that's shifting to do with around masculinity?
I think it's a really interesting space because historically, and we kind of touched on this and we'll touch on it again, but masculinity is a very, very broad spectrum. And, when you start to think about the way that brands get involved and what role brands should have, again, traditionally, the kind of male role models have been very much in sport and in kind of music, right? And that's still the case. But the thing that's interesting is in the last 15 years, maybe last 20 years or so, influencer culture has emerged, and you have this kind of new generation of role models. And like you said, there is this soft boy, gentle masculinity aesthetic that is beginning to emerge. And again, we kind of touched on it, but the way that the internet works and the way that kind of these different groups have moved online means that you can be influenced by this aesthetic even if geographically you're not close to it. So you've got people experimenting with these different ideas, these different ways of being, even if they are geographically moved. I think kind of when you begin to look at beyond internet culture into mainstream culture, there are changing attitudes to gender and to aesthetics within the media. The kind of growth of K-pop as a international tour de force. Frank Ocean, Tyler the Creator, Harry Styles, his recent campaigns, even Drake and A$AP Rocky have all played with those different ideas of masculinity as well. And that is beginning to impact the way that men see themselves and the way that they see people they've traditionally looked up to as well.
Over in beauty, nail varnish is definitely this entry point we're seeing into makeup in general. As we said, people like A$AP Rocky, Harry Styles, it's very, very normalised for all these male celebrities and influencers now. There's a lot of men experimenting with nail varnish, and a lot of brands are actually starting to take note as well. So we've seen this brand called Faculty, which are this modern grooming brand. They're very much based on streetwear drop culture. And their first kind of drop product was a set of nail lacquers and nail stickers. So it's definitely something that, we're seeing over in beauty as well.
That's fascinating that it's meeting streetwear as well.
Exactly, yeah, really interesting.
I think as well, Annie, the bit that I've definitely been exposed to is that kind of crossing over of beauty and men's grooming very much into the mainstream. So in the Peter Crouch podcast, obviously, former England footballer Peter Crouch, he talks about when kind of mid-noughties, he started smelling men wearing cologne on the pitch. And suddenly, the little thing that they carry with them when they enter the kind of football stadium isn't their boots, it's a grooming bag. And it's to make sure that they kind of touched up any concealer, touched up their hair and things before they go on the pitch. And how that's became such a thing, and is kind of trickling down in the mainstream. And certainly I've been exposed to a lot more brands that are kind of appealing to that mass market man. So we were talking about War Paint, which is a kind of tinted moisturizer, men's concealer, and then my personal favorite, Bro Glow, which is a fake tan specifically, geared towards that kind of mass market man.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing a lot of kind of these skincare kind of makeup hybrids coming through in the men's grooming category. What's interesting for beauty is that the male beauty consumer is no longer this like Lynx wearing macho man. They really want to take care of their skin. They really want to use makeup and skincare to actually look their best. We're seeing men really getting into their skincare. A big portion of this cohort is still kind of using it on a very ad hoc basis, though. It's not so embedded into like a routine or a ritual like it is with women, very much like before a big Zoom meeting, after a heavy night out kind of situation. And then, as Joe was saying, we're seeing a shift into the makeup arena. But with male-focused products, it's still very much a does what it says on the tin approach. The terminology is still quite geared towards a certain type of man. One of my favourite new releases is wellness brands Hims has just teamed up with baseball star Alex Rodriguez to launch a blur stick. So it's essentially a concealer, although they're not specifically calling it out as a concealer. They're calling it a stick to cover blemishes and razor burn. So there's definitely very much it does what it says on the tin, kind of bro-y terminology going on there.
I think, but that, that's the really common thread in menswear. I think, where you can put the male consumer at ease by talking about the practical, technical benefits of something rather than acknowledging their vanity or wish to wish to be attractive. I think that's an easier sell, and that's how a lot of clothing gets sold, because men can talk to each other on the terraces at the football, just to really stereotype men, but they can talk about those brands that they're wearing and the temperatures they withstand and how waterproof they are. And that's historically been the route in for men to get, kind of geeky about fashion, with, preceding the whole Raf Simons phenomenon and men suddenly being that it's cool to talk about fashion on that level. So yeah, it makes sense that would be the route in for a lot of brands to get into, beauty products, to me.
Yeah, I mean, beauty products obviously can essentially be used by anyone, but for a lot of men, having these male-specific brands that are emerging and these male-specific products are giving them this permission to explore the world of beauty, which is similar to what you were saying, Nick.
I think as well, building on that, Annie, the brand messaging around male grooming and the way in which corporations talk to men is also changing. So I noticed you touched on Lynx, or Axe, as it's kind of known in the rest of the world, earlier. And, I'm sure we all remember that kind of advert from 2006 where kind of slightly out of shape guy sprays himself with Axe, and just hundreds of thousands of these kind of Amazonian women come running from the oceans and can't resist him. And that was very much the theme for a lot of advertising targeted at men, kind of post Lads Mag era. And actually, if you take Axe or you take Lynx, as we say in the UK, and you look at their more recent advertising, they're working with Anthony Joshua, who is this kind of bastion of modern male masculinity, embodying achievement, success, and struggle. And I think for a lot of men, is that kind of balance between being quietly secure in their own skin. But then even they kind of took it further, and in 2007 they did the campaign "Is It Okay for Guys?", which is entirely based around thing that men have searched on Google, and just the kind of sheer breadth of topics, and it kind of gives you a real insight into how the Gen Z consumer are thinking, and it's 10 years apart almost exactly between the two ads. And I think it shows, to Nick's point, how far the kind of conversation has come around men and how they shop, how they think, how they talk to each other.
Yeah, grooming brands definitely used to be these perpetrators of toxic masculinity, and that has really shifted in the last 5 years, really. Even it's really interesting.
And just going back to that, the thing about nail varnish as well, quite recently Kid Cudi wore nail varnish and was called out, but also was very much supported when he just kind of put out a tweet that very clearly told people what to do with their opinions about his nail varnish. The Instagram picture's got over 140,000 likes. His tweet rebuffing all the criticism for it, that's reached 95,000 likes and 10,000 retweets. So I think it is about statement making, and then we get into this whole territory of gesture politics and all that sort of thing. But I do, I think that incident is quite clearly people showing that their support for, doing things in a new way and leaving old, quite restraining codes behind. It's refreshing. Especially
the Gen Z cohort, they are unapologetically using makeup to express themselves, as has been the case, with women wearing it for forever. Male beauty influencers are just as successful as their female counterparts. We know that. And as like Joe was saying before, boy bands like BTS are even the full-blown faces of makeup brands. There's definitely this other side of the spectrum that are really just going all in with makeup and using it as for what it is ultimately meant to be used for self-expression. And
I think you're really right, because it shows kind of a critical mass point that we're getting to with all of this, attitudes and products and just choices people can make. Because I think it would be easier for older generations to say, yeah, but we've been here before. Punks wore makeup, new romantics wore makeup, people wore nail varnish during the grunge period, and it all sort of died away again. But there's so much else happening politically in human rights and all that sort of stuff that is cementing the whole thing as a wider movement, that I think, anyone would make a mistake to dismiss this as a trend. It's not a trend. We're not going back.
I want to talk a little bit about, because we've talked about how important sport is in kind of defining masculinity. And I really want to sort of touch upon, a lot of these brands are teaming up with sports people to kind of sell their product. But I just really think it's very interesting how sport itself has changed, and how we're actually seeing the sportsman as a vulnerable person too. And I think you've shown me a video earlier, Joe, which was a Guinness ad with Gareth Thomas.
That one is kind of from 2015, but I wanted to include it because I think it's still so poignant, and it kind of, Gareth Thomas, captain was the captain of Wales, kind of stands at 6'5". Lots of footage of him coming off the rugby pitch covered in blood. This kind of absolute archetypal man, if you will. But the whole commercial, the whole premise is him talking about his vulnerability and how difficult it was for him to come out as gay in the professional rugby world, and then how quickly he was embraced, not only by his teammates, but by the sport in general. And I think that, that there are lots of stories like that, and especially kind of off the back of the Euros this year, there has been a lot more of a conversation around mental health, men's mental health in general, but also how we kind of treat these superstars and how we treat these kind of heroes of the sport. I think the kind of other thing that I would touch on, because it's another really interesting campaign, and I think it's a real insight into the spectrum of masculinity, is Gillette's 2019 commercial, which is "We believe the best a man can be," which again is this kind of broad sweeping message to stand up to sexism, to stand up to injustice, to kind of remove those old cliches of boys will be boys, and actually it was hugely controversial. And there were segments on Good Morning Britain saying, is this advert anti-man? Lots of think pieces. I think Donald Trump Jr. came out and said it was an attack on men globally. People were burning their razors, if that's possible, but they were definitely not buying Gillette products again. And actually, if you go onto the YouTube link, you can see that it's got about 1.9 million downvotes and kind of 600,000 upvotes. And I think it does kind of show that slight tension in the male space, in particularly online, in that it is a journey, and at the far end, Gen Z consumers, younger people in particular, are adopting different aesthetics and playing with kind of traditional gender roles, different outfits and things. However, lots of people aren't quite there yet, and understanding. I think David Ogilvy, the kind of original Madman, said that advertising reflects society rather than creates it. And the big difference has been in the last 10 years that brands have stopped reflecting and they've started creating, they've started standing for things. And we're seeing that come through more and more with different brands, similarly to the Nike and Colin Kaepernick example as well, earlier last year or year before.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that it reflects the sort of pet pack mentality that's come to define men's relationships with each other and what they present outwardly. And interestingly, because we sort of were thinking about this in conjunction with men redefining their identities post-pandemic, and what does that mean? And I think it's just really interesting. We were talking about this during our prep for Trends Days, or among the menswear contributors, and we got the sense between us that men have been able to take this time away from the pack mentality, spending more time with people they might not have planned to spend that much time with. Could be their families, could be flatmates, could be anything. But they're taken out of that sort of pack environment, and they started to make their own decisions, and new trends started to emerge.
Are there other brands out there that you feel are really kind of you're impressed by because they're sort of tackling the old sort of toxic masculinity and you think are really challenging and moving with the times? Maybe we'll go to you, Nick, first. Are there people that are impressing you in the fashion space? So
there's a really recent collection that was devised by Tommy Hilfiger in conjunction with India Moore, the non-binary actor who starred in the TV show Pose. And that was a really, really successful one. And to me, that felt like quite groundbreaking in that before, when brands and retailers have sort of tried to get into this space for various reasons, it's the end result, regardless of the intentions at the beginning, has been a big baggy hoodie and some boyfriend jeans, which is comfortable for everyone involved. Couples, because there's like the whole couple dressing thing where heterosexual couples wear the same items together and it's cutesy and coordinating. but more than that, this collection was the first time I'd seen like bralette tops, quite sporty pieces, but worn by models who seem to identify as male in the photo shoot and that kind of thing, as well as tailoring pieces, skirts and trousers, but worn with blazers. So it felt like one of the first truly inclusive, quite mainstream collections I've seen. It's still quite expensive, so I suppose that's a limit to it being truly open to everybody everywhere. But yeah, I think that in particular, Tommy Hilfiger has done a lot over the years to break down boundaries. I mean, Tommy Hilfiger was one of the first designers and brands to embrace those kind of preppy brands with hip hop culture. Lots of other brands weren't so keen on that association. They didn't want to be put together with black culture effectively. So from that period onwards, from the sort of late 90s, noughties onwards, that brand has done a lot to align itself. And generally, I think, has done it in an inclusive way that hasn't meant that other people have needed to call the brand out for its behaviours. And this was another step down that road to including different body shapes and different expressions of gender, basically. So that was a great one, and it's good because it's a really recent one. And that's on the fashion feed if anyone wants to have a look at that as well.
Because when I think of how gender inclusive has been, it has been almost in some ways in fashion sort of just a slight move on from unisex. But actually what would be truly progressive, right, is that you'd have a dress in that collection for men, and you would really be mixing up the traditional ideas of masculine and feminine. So is that the way you see that hopefully going in fashion? Yeah,
I think yes, and it's to draw a bit of to point out a similar example, like the advert that Joe's referenced there, the Guinness advert, and to talk about a very masculine looking gay, albeit a gay man, but a rugby player, and to say for him to express vulnerability is sort of like the equivalent of where we've been. It's okay to express that identity if you still come across as a masculine male. The step we need to progress to next is it's actually okay to be a feminine male and express all those things as well, and to make all identities acceptable, not just say it's all right to be gay if you're really butch, to boil it down somewhat. So retailers and brands in that that want to venture into that space, the real brave thing to do now is to do what you've said and create pieces that traditionally would have been perceived as extremely feminine, but to say whoever wants to wear this, it's okay if they wear it, and introduce that narrative.
Annie, what are you seeing in the beauty space in terms of brands that are really challenging those sort of stereotypical versions of masculinity that you're looking to as admirable, progressive type brands?
Yeah, so something we're talking about over on WGSN in our latest forecast is the concept of bro bathing. So self-care for men is becoming really destigmatized, as we've touched on. And we've seen in general people really beginning to recognise it's not like a really indulgent, selfish act. It's really important for mental wellness, mental health. Just last month, Gillette, as we've actually name dropped a few times, they are very progressive with this kind of thing. For its Father's Day campaign, partnered with a meditation app. So they release a selection of guided meditations with Headspace. But for bro bathing, what we're talking about is men really beginning to recognise the benefits of like a long, luxurious soak in the bath. Now, you've got your face mask, you've got your snacks. For a long time, it's been the ultimate self-care moment for women, and men are really starting to take note. So there's a brand called Babe who have released a collection of very like male-targeted essential oils and bath salts, and that's a trend that we're really excited about on WGSN Beauty. I think for definitely a certain cohort of men, for beauty brands, it's about communicating the functional and the physical benefits of beauty products very much still. Everybody wants to look their best and feel their best. There's no really argument against that. It's about breaking the stigmas around how men go about achieving that. So wellness brand Hims does a really great job of this. They use a lot of like tongue-in-cheek marketing, lots of meme culture, to touch on those kind of more sensitive subjects, bring men into that conversation, and they touch on anything from, hair loss to mental health. So those two brands are quite interesting from a beauty perspective.
So just to wrap up, I just wonder what advice you'd give to brands. Perhaps we'll go to Jo first, who are kind of navigating this new terrain of this fluid masculinity. What do you think, there's that fear of alienating the older maybe or the traditional consumer. What do you think brands need to think about?
I think first of all, brands need a purpose. In 2021, you can't stand on the sidelines and kind of not stand up for something you believe in. Gen Z are going to make up 30% of, in fact, they already make up 30% of the global population. And they are a much more progressive generation. And I think if you look already at the new role models for young men, people like Marcus Rashford, who is playing for Manchester United and feeding children. He donated 125% of his salary to charity last year. He represents a new kind of era of men. Even people like Little Huddy, who is a singer and creator and actually kind of started the TikTok hype house. He is popularizing that e-boy style and can be seen wearing skirts. And then kind of from a comedian perspective, Bo Burnham, he released his Netflix special where he talks a lot about mental health, which is something that for men has been stigmatized for a very, very long time. And these are kind of three completely different industries across all different sectors, but they are the new generation, and they are the new generation of what young men look up to. And to kind of fail to move with the times will make sure that you get left behind. So it is a spectrum, and there can be backlash, as we've seen with the Gillette adverts. However, the tide is going in that direction for sure. Fantastic.
Nick, have you got anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that aspect of inclusion is important to do, as for brands to do inward facing as well as outward facing. So it's important to have the right voices in the room to achieve those objectives of being more inclusive. So, start asking around within your own business, are there people you could be talking to within your own four walls? If there aren't, start speaking to groups who represent those people, and make sure anything you do is as authentic as it can possibly be, because, we don't need to explain call out culture. People will pick holes in it, things if they're not done authentically. So that's the key to it all. And then that's the same thing applies to the technical aspect of producing products that do fit or loads of different body shapes. There's a massive technical issue to be crossed there and worked out. So that involves speaking to the right people as well. It's going to involve focus groups. It's going to involve liaising with groups that understand, how businesses might get to that point anyway. It's really just about speaking to as many relevant voices as possible and making sure that the right people are heard, I suppose.
Thank you so much to Jo McDonnell, Nick Paget and Annie Johnston for talking with me on today's show. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, then please subscribe to the show, which is available on all major podcast platforms. If you really like what you've heard, please leave us a rating and review on iTunes. If you're interested in what we've been talking about today, then please head over to wgsn.com to find out how you can get access to all of our insight and analysis. We're constantly publishing new content around how we can design a brighter, better future for our industries. We've published several reports covering masculinity on Insight, and further related content can be found on the fashion and beauty platforms. Thanks to our podcast producer, Roland Bodenham. And again, thank you for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks for the next episode. So until then, stay well and healthy, and we'll see you next time.